Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
It is a politician's go-to line during campaign season. The only poll that matters is the one on election day. So why are we always hearing about public opinion polls leading up to the ballot? X party leading Y party by 23 points, or X percentage of people say healthcare is their number one concern, Y percentage say it's education. Sound familiar? Well, the question is, how much weight do these polls carry with voters and political parties, with Ontarians casting ballots in February and a federal election in a matter of months? Will these opinions matter, and will they prove to be accurate? I'm Melanie Ng, and this is The Big Story. Our guest today has decades of experience on this very topic as a veteran pollster. He is also a sought-after speaker, author, and strategist. Welcome to the show, John Wright.
Great to be with you.
All right, before we get into where we are now when it comes to public opinion polls, can we take a little step back into the history books, how they began and why they started and how they've evolved since that time?
Well, it really came about in the 1930s when a guy named George Gallup decided that he would impose his way of doing the science of collecting information on what people's opinions would be. And what he discovered, and what we continue to do nowadays, is if you talk to a group of people, a large group of people, but you select them randomly, you oftentimes get a pretty good snapshot of what that group thinks. So he used to go door to door, knock on doors, but he might pick, let's just do all the corner houses. And, there was some randomness to it. So he is called the father of polling, but it really is market research tools that we use. So everybody kind of thinks there's something voodoo about polling, when in fact, it's the same tools that they use nowadays to determine the market share for McDonald's or Coke, or how many people want to buy a home. It's exactly the same, but there's some technicalities around it because we're measuring vote and momentum. So that's where it gets a little more dicey, where you've got to know what you're doing.
Let's talk about the methodology, because as you said, it began with a door-to-door knock, like let's go maybe alternate housing. It has evolved. It went through phone, landlines. Would you say majority of it is done now in 2025 online?
Vast majority. When I started doing this in the 1990s, we were using telephone. In fact, we had telephone centers across the country to get that randomness done. And the reason was because it cost money if you were doing it long distance across. And so you put those things, outlets in different provinces. And then as it got cheaper, you put them all in one place. So we were doing all the telephone, and then this thing called the internet started to bubble around. And we figured out that you could actually get people to sign up and come inside that internet thingy. Well, that's continued to this day, where there are companies, market research companies, or people who have these big pools of people where they opt into, it's almost like going to a swimming pool. They opt into a great big pool, or they sign in from somewhere else. You screen them. You ask a lot of questions about who they are, where they live, their income, their education, their gender, and a few more things. And then all of a sudden, you've got this pool of hundreds of thousands of people. And what you can do online is get them to do a survey. And methodologically, what you're doing is picking people within that pool so that it's actually randomized. The second type of polling that you hear about is called IVR, and that's interactive voice response, and that's where a computer calls you. Again, it's randomized. You pick up the phone, usually your cell phone, even a landline, and it says, do you want to take it? Take the survey. It asks you some questions about whether you're male, female, that sort of stuff. Then it delivers your questions to you, and then it says, would you like to come and do some more? And when you say yes, it puts you in their pool. So it's all about pooling the people. So you do hear about those. And then the last one you don't hear very much about, and that's telephone. Hardly anybody has a landline nowadays. The only time you use it is during an election campaign, where you might if you do 1,000 people that are on an online survey, you might put an extra band of landlines and cell phones in there just to make sure that you've got it covered from base to base. So nowadays it's basically IVR, and the other one would be called online polling.
So I'm thinking, John, as you're describing this, the opt-in to get access to that pool, thinking of me personally, I don't know if I've ever opted in to do one of these polls. And, if I were to sit randomly with a group of my friends, I don't know how many of us have done that. And so the question being, does it accurately represent certain parts of the population who don't want to be polled? Is it weighted somehow within the results to really capture certain parts of the population?
Great question. And that's why you actually get people into these pools, and they don't do surveys all the time. And you want to kind of mix them around, and maybe you won't use them for a bunch of things. But there are enough people in this country, 41 million, I think it is nowadays, that you can get a good adult population that will opt into these. But you also screen them. You also make sure you know where they live. You also then take the census and you're able to overlay it with your pool of people, and you can kind of go, yeah, I've got these many women, these many men, these many people who are senior citizens, these many voters, because you've analyzed that, and you get a very representative sample. So, again, in the province of Ontario, there's 16 million people. To do a poll, I need to get about 800 people within that pool representing Ontario, and I can extract the information, make sure that it's representative of the census. It's like tuning it in on a radio, and there you go. You get the results of your survey.
All right, now here come the results. What about the accuracy? So if we're looking back in the history books, and there are so many different public opinion polls, election polls out there, some of them are so close to the final result, and others feel like they're completely way off. So why is there such a difference?
Well, a few things. Actually, in around 2015, there was a major shakeup around the world with polling. They got it wrong in different countries, whether it be Poland or Israel or Italy or Canada, the United States. And one of the things that we suddenly realized was that while we could, curate these large pools, to put it in the vernacular, is they took on a personality of their own. You have to balance it. You're recruiting from certain areas, and that was a wake-up call to the industry. Now they've corrected it since that time, because there was a huge amount of scrutiny. In fact, there's even now a trade association for market research people called the Canadian Research and Insights Council. And if you sign up to be a member of that, you have to do certain things to make sure that doesn't happen again. And you have to publish all your results on your website so people can go and see how the homework. But I think after that happened, it tightened up a bit. So I would say the following. Some of the big firms you hear about all the time that have been around for many, many years, and this is in Canada. It's not in the United States, where they've got the Electoral College that actually, chooses the president. But there's about 4 or 5 firms that are deadly accurate on this stuff almost all the time. You get, less experienced or more experimental groups who would come out and they would try their best because they want to get some publicity or otherwise, but sometimes they miss the mark. So it's almost like every other, profession that you get into. Some have been doing it for a long time. As I said, I've done 22 election campaigns, and, whether it be municipal, provincial, or federal, you get a certain knack to know what to do and what to look for. And plus, and more importantly, you've hired all these people who are really, really, really smart with statistics, and they're able to do it for you. So best way to look at this, I would say from a methodological point of view, there are different tools to get the answers, but you have to use the same sort of techniques to get at people. You have to take the province of Ontario and divide it into different census areas, and that's oftentimes the exchange areas where your telephone is, and you have to get a randomized sample in each one of those. And so, you got a place like Belleville with 65,000 people representing, a province of 16 million. It might be that you only need 5 people there. And you get, 25 people in another place. When you put it all together and it's randomized, that's when you start to tweak it, especially for voting, and that's a little bit different.
Let me ask you this. As a journalist, I have said plus or minus margin of error. I've used that terminology over and over and over. For those who've not maybe taken apart what that means, what exactly, when you hear margin of error, when it comes to a poll, what does that mean?
Well, if we take everything that I said and think of it as a swimming pool, and if you've gone in and not spent your time in one corner of the swimming pool talking to a gathering of 100 people, that are in the pool overall, and you've done your randomness, then there are scientific calculations that say that when you're asked, how confident are you that you've got what you need? And I might say, well, I'm 95% confident in that. Then there's a formula that you apply that says, well, if your pool had 100 people in it and you wanted to make it representative of a certain area, then in fact it would have a less confidence than if you had 1,000 people that you could talk to, because you'd get more people with different representation from outside of your neighborhood. So the difference would be that if you had 100 people, it says the margin of error, if you were to do this 20 times, 19 times out of 20, it would fall within that margin of error of 10 points. But if you did 1,500, it would 19 times out of 20 on that 20th one, it may fall within the margin of error of 2.5%. So the bigger the pool, the smaller that margin is. And it's just a technicality to say, if you want to have confidence in that poll based on the true methodology that's representative of the public out there, then this is what it means. So let's clarify that. You would do that normally, but you're also talking about voters. And voters are within that pool of the population because not everybody votes. People say they might. So you have to be very careful with that. And that would be probably even a smaller margin of error.
John, from your experience, can polls, well, they can do a number of things, but can they potentially do harm? And when I ask you that, that you can take that in any direction that you'd like, but harm by way of what's to come for when we head to the ballot, or what a political party and how they may interpret it. What are your thoughts?
Well, the Supreme Court looked at polling years and years ago. And if you ever get a chance to read their decision, it's actually pretty interesting because they go through a lot of this. I think what polls tend to do in these circumstances is drive the media outlets to go in a particular direction. And it's by no mistake that almost all the polls are done with a media partner. And so it does show some momentum. It sometimes means that if it looks like it's really, really lopsided, and ahead of time, some people won't go to the polls. If it, in fact, is got some issues that are being talked about, it might drive the conversation in that way. But to suffice to say, when you start to see all of the public opinion polls out there, there's a variety of opinions, and you're getting everybody talking about it. Those people who tend to go out and vote have not really been influenced by the poll itself, but by all the advertising and all the door knocking and all the media coverage on there. So polling plays a slice, it drives things, but it can't compete against, the millions of dollars of advertising and all of that other sort of stuff that goes into a political machine to get you to go out and vote.
Political parties, you often hear them say, sometimes this is just outside noise. We're only focused on election day. But in your opinion, you have been in these rooms with a lot of decision makers. How closely are they paying attention to these public opinion polls heading into the election day?
Well, they're not paying much attention to these ones, but what they are doing is their own work behind the scenes. And secondly, they're focused on those people who they think, you basically get 100 people, again, 100 people in a room, you might get 25 of those people are with you all the way. And then there's another 25 who are against you all the way. They're concentrating on the 50% that are in that mushy middle. And of that, maybe 18% of the total group they are just never going to make up their mind. So they're focused maybe on about 40% of the population, and they know where they are because they've got all that information about their demographics and their geography, and they know where their candidates are. So what they're trying to do is to figure out the slogans or the momentum from the group of those people who may be somewhat undecided, or who are, they say, yeah, we'd like to vote this way, but I'm not fully there yet. That's why they're doing what they're doing. They're looking at the groups, whereas you and I are looking at the whole province to find out what's going on.
Um, are there certain polls that provide incentives? So they will give you a credit toward this, or potentially you'll get paid by participating. Do those incentives still exist?
There are incentives for people to join a pool of you call it a sample, to join on to a pool online poll. And as I said, it's got hundreds of thousands of people into it, and it does reward people, but you have to do a fair number of things in order to be rewarded. And the rewards are not very, you never make a living off of doing polls, and being in one of those. So there's not enough of an incentive there to sway people in and of itself. And secondly, if you're doing the polling, you can ask people, whether they voted in the last election, and you can take a look and see how that is and how it fits with the entire group. That, for many people, is just the incentive to get in there and participate in something. But it's not driven by people of any partisan nature. You can look at how people have voted before, and you can determine whether that is having an influence, but normally it's not having an influence whatsoever.
John, let me ask you, where do you see the future of public opinion polling? We've seen the evolution as you've walked us through the history of. Do you see it still having a big role in future election cycles, in marketing and all this? I'm sure it'll still have a role, but where do you see it sitting, and how do you see it playing a role within the future?
Well, I think market research is a staple of people who are in private practice or in the public sector, trying to determine what people think about things. So that tool in the toolbox is always going to be there. The question is, what's the methodology? And as we move more and more, through the AI corridor, there's a number of people who a few years ago started to experiment with conversational computer ways of getting information with you. So rather than having a questionnaire done the same way where you just answer a bunch of questions, it actually has a conversation with you. And you know this right now, that I've got on my ChatGPT, I've got a voice that I can communicate with and have a conversation with. It's like that, where you're able to go through and ask people questions, have a conversation, dig in a little bit further, and then go back and do the results. I think that's where we're headed in the future. But again, it'll depend on how the market research field evolves. Because the people who pay for market research are those people who, are doing it out of their companies. The people who pay for the polls in election campaigns, few and far between. I don't think of a media outlet nowadays that actually pays for a poll to be published in their newspaper or, on the radio or on television. It usually is one of the larger companies that has said, look, we got to be there because it's our commitment to the democratic way that you get to see all of these things, and you don't get people just standing up. Like, I remember when I first started this, that you actually didn't have many polls that were out in the 1990s, and you used to get political people who would go to a scrum where the media is and say, look, if you want to see what the real results are, here they are. And that would be the only thing out there. At least in a democracy the way we have so many different polling methodologies and firms, and they have some transparency requirements for them, that you get to see and hear what people think. And that's the difference, where, you'll get a clanger every once in a while. It's called an outlier in a poll, and somebody will get it wrong. But the vast majority of time now, it is very, very accurate. And I don't think you want to have the public deprived of knowing what the other party leaders and others are seeing about what people think. So it is actually contributed, not for the money, but mainly for a bit of the sport and for democracy itself.
I think these polls, they are going to stick around, and we're going to see a lot of them in the months to come. John Wright, political strategist and veteran pollster, thank you so much for joining today.
It's a pleasure. Get out and vote.
That was The Big Story. You can always send us feedback on this episode or any other episode by emailing us at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can also find us on the Seeker app or on all of your favorite podcast players. You can rate, review, follow, and don't be shy. You can share. I'm Melanie Ng. Thank you for listening.